Sauron's army was the largest military force Middle-earth had ever seen, and the backbone of it was a creature so pathetic that its own allies named it Slave. From the cannon fodder grunts of Mordor to the elite berserkers of Isengard, every orc breed in Tolkien's world was built different, and today we're breaking down all of them, what makes each one dangerous, and why some of them could barely function without a leash. Starting with the absolute bottom of the food chain, Snaga. The word Snaga is black speech for slave. Not a species name, not a rank, not a title of honor. It's an insult. The Uruk-hai used it to describe the smaller, weaker orc breeds the way you describe something stuck to the bottom of your shoe. And the cruel irony is that these are the most common orcs in all of Middle-earth, the single most numerous force in Sauron's entire war machine, and their own side couldn't even say their name without sneering. Physically, Snaga are exactly what you'd expect from Morgoth's baseline model. Roughly 4 to 5 feet tall, bow-legged, sallow-skinned, fanged, and built almost exclusively for underground survival. Their night vision was enhanced for life in caves and tunnels, which sounds useful until you realize the trade-off. Sunlight didn't just bother them, it crippled them. Sauron literally had to darken the sky with volcanic ash from Mount Doom before launching major operations because his most abundant soldiers couldn't fight during the day. Think about that for a second. The most common orc in existence was functionally useless for half of every 24-hour cycle, but here's where it gets worse. Even when you got them onto a battlefield, Snaga couldn't stop killing each other. They were internally chaotic by design, filled with hatred for everything including themselves. They destroyed each other's work out of spite, murdered their own comrades over petty disputes, and required permanent physical domination from chieftains and officers just to keep a unit from collapsing before the enemy even showed up. Every formation needed babysitters. Every march needed enforcers cracking skulls just to maintain order. So why did Sauron bother with them at all? One word: numbers. A single orc mother could theoretically produce hundreds of offspring across a lifespan stretching several centuries. That reproductive math is the entire reason Snaga existed in dark armies. Sauron didn't need them to be good. He needed them to be replaceable. Lose 10,000 at Osgiliath, breed 10,000 more. They were the inexhaustible cannon fodder underpinning every military campaign Mordor ever launched, and Sauron burned through them like kindling because he could always make more. But at least Snaga had the excuse of being Morgoth's rough draft. The orcs lurking beneath the misty mountains. They had centuries to improve and somehow got even worse. Moria. Orcs. The Fellowship didn't walk into an abandoned mine. They walked into the largest goblin stronghold in Middle-earth and had zero idea until it was way too late. Moria orcs are fascinating because they don't belong to Sauron. Not really. Around the year 2480 of the Third Age, these orcs moved into Khazad-dûm, the greatest underground dwarven kingdom ever built, and they didn't conquer it. They just filled the vacuum. The dwarves had already fled after waking the Balrog, and the orcs poured into miles of empty halls, forges, and tunnels like rats claiming an abandoned mansion. They turned the most magnificent underground civilization in history into a goblin warren. But here's where it gets interesting. Because they were so isolated from Mordor, they developed completely differently from Sauron's forces. Where Mordor ran a military machine with standardized equipment, centralized forges, and a clear chain of command flowing down from Sauron himself, Moria orcs went tribal. Clan-based societies, independent chieftains, zero standardized armor, and genuine autonomy in how they operated. Nobody was sending orders from Barad-dûr telling them what to do on a Tuesday. They raided when they wanted, fought who they wanted, and answered to their own leaders. Think of it as the difference between a professional army and dozens of independent warbands sharing the same mountain range. But the wildest thing about Moria orcs is the size disparity within their own population. The rank and file were small, scrappy creatures, exactly what you picture when someone says goblin. Then you look at their chieftains, and it's like a completely different species. Ozog was described as a great orc with a huge ironclad head, yet still agile and strong. His son Bolg commanded thousands of orcs at the Battle of Five Armies. These weren't just slightly bigger goblins, they were terrifying outliers towering over their own kin and they emerged from the exact same population that produced the little tunnel crawlers. Nobody fully explains how that works, but it made Moria orc leadership genuinely dangerous in a way that small goblin foot soldiers never were on their own. Their real specialty, though, was underground warfare. Centuries of living in tunnels gave them expertise that no outside force could replicate. Cave combat, siege tactics designed specifically for stone fortifications, and an intimate knowledge of subterranean geography that turned Moria into a death trap for anyone foolish enough to enter. The Fellowship learned that the hard way. But that expertise came with a brutal trade-off. Moria orcs had extreme sunlight sensitivity, even worse than standard common orcs. These creatures almost never left their mountain systems during daylight, which meant their entire military doctrine depended on staying underground or fighting at night. And that's exactly why the Battle of Five Armies became a case study in what happens when underground specialists get dragged into the one environment that neutralizes everything they're good at. Thousands of Moria orcs poured out into open terrain where sunlight stripped away every tactical advantage they'd spent centuries building. The very thing that made them deadly in the deep places of the world made them vulnerable the moment they stepped outside. If you think feral independence sounds dangerous, wait until you see what Sauron's standardized war machine produced for the Black Gate. Morannon orcs. Sauron looked at the chaos of tribal orc warfare and decided to solve it the same way every empire in history has: standardization. The Morannon orcs are what happens when a Dark Lord discovers mass production. These are common orcs, genetically identical to the Snaga we just talked about. Same template, same base level creature. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of letting them scatter into tribes, scavenge their own weapons, and develop their own little cultures like the Moria orcs did, Sauron manufactured them to spec. Same crude scimitars. Same shields stamped with the red eye. Same basic armor configured by rank. Every single one rolling off the line like products from a factory. And that's not an exaggeration. There's something almost corporate about the whole operation. Where Moria orcs improvised and adapted to their environment, Morannon orcs received a kit and followed orders. They weren't warriors. They were units, interchangeable, replaceable, and designed to be exactly that. But here's why that actually worked. At the Battle of the Morannon, Sauron fielded at least 60,000 creatures, and Morannon orcs formed the bulk of that number. Their job was never to win individual fights. It was to absorb casualties, hold defensive positions at the Black Gate, and free up elite units like the Uruks for operations that actually required skill. Think of them as the foundation that let everything above them function. Not impressive on their own, but remove them and the entire structure collapses, which is exactly what happened. The moment the One Ring was destroyed and the magical command structure holding Mordor's army together disintegrated, those 60,000 reliable soldiers just stopped functioning. They broke. They ran. They fell into the earth as Mordor literally crumbled beneath them. No adaptation, no regrouping, no fallback plan. Because Morannon orcs were never built to think for themselves. Every ounce of their effectiveness was borrowed from Sauron's will. And when that will vanished, they had nothing left. That's the real lesson of the Morannon orc. Sauron made a deliberate choice to manufacture mediocrity at scale instead of quality in limited numbers. And for a while, it was the smartest military decision in Middle-earth. Predictable soldiers who execute complex orders reliably are worth more than 1,000 creative fighters who might ignore you. But the trade-off is brutal. The same obedience that made them logistically superior made them creatively useless. They could follow a plan perfectly, but the second that plan stopped making sense, they had zero capacity to build a new one. But if Sauron's answer to the orc problem was standardization, someone else took a much darker approach, one that involved blurring the line between orc and man entirely. Half-orcs, goblin men. Here's where things stop being about monsters and start being about something genuinely disturbing. Because half-orcs weren't born from some magical accident or dark ritual gone wrong. They were the result of a cold, calculated breeding program that spanned generations, and the concept behind it is worse than you think. At some point during the First Age, Morgoth looked at his orc armies and realized they had a ceiling. They were strong, sure, vicious, absolutely. But they were stupid. They hated sunlight, and they couldn't operate independently for more than 5 minutes without tearing each other apart. So he came up with a solution that sounds like it belongs in a horror movie. Take human populations, corrupt them over generations through servitude and dark magic until their minds and habits approximated those of orcs, and then breed them together. The offspring would inherit orc ferocity with human intelligence and adaptability. But here's the part that makes this even more unsettling. Saruman didn't invent this, he rediscovered techniques from earlier ages and industrialized them beneath Isengard, replicating programs that Morgoth and Sauron had already run on smaller scales thousands of years prior. He just scaled it up. The results were physically unpredictable. Some half-orcs reached full human height, others still looked, in Tolkien's words, more than half like a goblin. The human genes expressed more consistently in behavior and cognition than in appearance, meaning you could have a creature that looked goblinish, but thought and fought closer to a man. That inconsistency is part of what made them so dangerous, because you never knew exactly what you were dealing with. But the real game changer was sunlight tolerance. Half-orcs inherited enough from their human ancestry to endure broad daylight without the crippling weakness that plagued every other orc variant. The attack at Amonhen happened in the middle of the day. That operation was completely impossible with standard orc forces. Saruman would have needed to darken the sky on a scale he couldn't sustain. Half-orcs made it a non-issue. And here's where it gets truly unsettling. Saruman didn't just use half-orcs as soldiers, he used them as spies. Throughout Eriador and near the Sheer, half-orc agents operated as intelligence operatives, gathering information, conducting reconnaissance, and blending into human settlements well enough to go undetected. These weren't mindless brutes following orders, they required independent decision-making, social awareness, and the ability to pass among men without raising suspicion. By the time Saruman's forces moved on the Shire, half-orc spies had already been embedded there for years. The invasion didn't start with an army, it started with creatures that could sit in a tavern and listen. But if half-orcs were Saruman's answer to orc limitations, Sauron had been working on his own solution for far longer, and the results were even more terrifying. Uruks, Sauron's Uruks. Before Saruman ever set foot in a breeding pit, Sauron had already cracked the code. Sometime before the year 2475 of the Third Age, a new kind of orc appeared in Mordor, and nobody in Gondor saw it coming. The Uruks didn't arrive with a warning. There was no slow military buildup, no intelligence reports filtering back to Minas Tirith about a new threat. They simply appeared ravaging Ithilien and overrunning Osgiliath, and the soldiers defending those positions immediately realized they were fighting something they'd never encountered before. These orcs were bigger, faster, stronger, and they fought with a discipline that common orcs had never demonstrated. But here's what made them truly different from every orc that came before. Physically, Uruks approached human height, towering over the 4 to 5 foot Snaga that Gondor's defenders had trained against for generations. They wielded short swords and spears instead of crude scimitars, carried shields stamped with the red eye of Sauron, and moved with a coordination that suggested actual military training rather than mob violence. This wasn't natural selection slowly producing bigger orcs over time. This was deliberate engineering. Sauron personally invested dark magic and pseudo-biological manipulation into enhancing orc stock, and the Uruks were the result. And the equipment gap tells you exactly where Sauron's priorities sat. Compare an Uruk's forged short sword and marked shield to a Morannon orc's crude scimitar and basic armor. The difference is night and day. Sauron was pouring resources into his elite forces, while common orcs got whatever was left over. But here's where it gets interesting. Even with all that engineering, Sauron couldn't fix the one flaw baked into orcs since Morgoth first created them thousands of years earlier. Sunlight sensitivity. Uruks handled daylight better than common orcs, but the weakness persisted enough that Sauron continued darkening the skies before major Uruk deployments. Whether that was to squeeze out maximum combat performance, or because the residual sensitivity genuinely degraded their effectiveness, the result was the same. His finest engineered soldiers still couldn't fully shake the original template's greatest weakness. There's also the population problem. True Uruks were rare. Sauron spent centuries building up his Uruk forces, which tells you this wasn't some emergency wartime measure. This was a long-term research and development program, generations of selective breeding and magical enhancement to produce a warrior caste that justified the investment. But centuries of work still only yielded limited numbers compared to his hundreds of thousands of common orcs. That scarcity dictated exactly how they were used. Uruk served as shock troops and vanguard units, the tip of the spear in critical engagements. You don't waste centuries of breeding by throwing them into meat grinder assaults. They were too valuable to spend carelessly and too few to replace quickly. The Uruks proved the concept. They proved that orc stock could be enhanced into something approaching a real military elite, something that could catch even Gondor completely off guard. But they also proved that the concept had a ceiling. The sunlight problem remained. The numbers stayed limited. The engineering was impressive, but incomplete. Which is exactly why someone else decided to take Sauron's prototype and perfect it. Uruk-hai, Saruman's Uruks. Everything we've covered up to this point, every breed, every variant, every incremental improvement was building to this. Saruman looked at what Sauron had spent roughly 1,000 years refining through selective breeding and magical enhancement, and he said, I can do better. And the terrifying part is, he was right. Saruman didn't start from nothing. He took Sauron's existing Uruk model, a template that had already been optimized over centuries of gradual improvement, and layered his own enhancements on top of it. Intensive magical augmentation, human hybridization, generations of breeding compressed into years through sheer resource expenditure. Where Sauron had the patience of an immortal, Saruman had the desperation of a traitor on a deadline. But the results speak for themselves. Physically, Uruk-hai exceeded even Sauron's best Uruks in almost every measurable way. Taller and broader, with builds that were athletic rather than simply bulky, the larger specimens stood above 6 feet, putting them at or beyond human height, with dramatically greater muscle mass. But here's the part that matters for actual combat. Their frames weren't just big for the sake of being big. They were optimized. Longer reach, greater leverage, superior sustained fighting capability over extended engagements. These weren't brutes swinging wildly, they were built like weapons. But the real revolution wasn't size or strength, it was sunlight. For thousands of years, every single Dark Lord's battle plan in Middle-earth operated under one foundational constraint. Orcs couldn't fight effectively in daylight. Every campaign, every siege, every raid had to account for this. Sauron literally darkened the sky over Gondor just to move his armies. That's how deeply embedded this limitation was in orc military doctrine, and Saruman just removed it. The human genetic component in Uruk-hai granted them functional sunlight tolerance, meaning they could operate in full daylight with minimal degradation. One change. One breakthrough. And suddenly, the free peoples of Middle-earth faced an enemy that could attack around the clock, that didn't need magical cloud cover, that could march through open plains at noon without slowing down. Nobody was prepared for that because nobody had ever needed to be. Their equipment matched their elite status. Broadswords instead of the crude scimitars carried by common orcs. Great bows made from yew, comparable in power and range to human longbows. Standardized armor bearing the white hand of Saruman, giving them unit identification and visual cohesion that most orc forces never achieved. But the equipment alone isn't what made them dangerous. It was the discipline to actually use it properly. Uruk-hai fought in coordinated formations, they maintained unit cohesion under pressure. They didn't dissolve into infighting the moment a battle turned chaotic, which is exactly what common orcs did every single time. Cognitively, they were enhanced alongside their physical improvements. Uruk-hai possessed sufficient intelligence and independence to function as officers, adapt tactics to changing conditions on the ground, and maintain operational effectiveness without someone constantly screaming orders at them. Think about what that means. For the first time, a Dark Lord had soldiers who could think for themselves without immediately using that independence to betray each other. Helm's Deep is the proof of concept. 10,000 Uruk-hai attacking a stone fortress in a rainstorm at midnight, carrying ladders, siege equipment, and explosive charges. Organized, disciplined, relentless. Documented engagements from the War of the Ring suggest it took the combined strength of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli fighting together to clear a single battalion, and all three were nearly exhausted by the end. 3 of the most capable warriors in Middle-earth pushed to their limits by 1 unit of Uruk-hai. And here's the uncomfortable question that hangs over all of it. Saruman produced roughly 10,000 Uruk-hai total. Sauron commanded hundreds of thousands of common orcs. 10,000 nearly broke Rohan. If Saruman had been given more time, more resources, more generations to refine the process, would 10,000 have even been the ceiling? But raw power, no matter how engineered, still needs someone to wield it, and that brings us to the orcs who didn't just fight in armies, they commanded them. Orci Chieftains. Every other orc type on this list can be explained by a breeding program. Sauron's Uruks came from dark engineering. Saruman's Uruk-hai came from hybridization pits. Morannon orcs came from standardized mass production. But orc chieftains? They weren't manufactured. They're what happens when the most violent, cruel, and ruthlessly competitive society in Middle-earth accidentally selects for genuine excellence over centuries. And that makes them the most unsettling classification on this entire list. An orc chieftain isn't a separate breed. It's an extreme outlier. An individual who emerged from an existing orc population through some combination of exceptional genetics, accumulated combat experience, and direct magical enhancement from a Dark Lord patron. These individuals were elevated so far above their origin species that they functionally operated as their own category. The physical range alone was extraordinary. Azog, chieftain of the Moria orcs, was described as a great orc with a huge ironclad head, yet agile and strong. Not just a big goblin. Something qualitatively different from the thousands of orcs he commanded. But raw physicality was only part of it. Gothmog, Sauron's lieutenant and second-in-command during the siege of Minas Tirith, demonstrated reflexes sufficient to dodge an enormous boulder at the last second by sidestepping. That alone suggests capabilities approaching superhuman levels. But here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Gothmog wasn't just fast, he was brilliant. His tactical record stands apart from any other orc in Middle-earth's history. He called for Grond to destroy the gate of Minas Tirith. He used the river to take Osgiliath by surprise. He employed psychological manipulation against enemy forces mid-battle. This is strategic intelligence matching or exceeding the top human military commanders of the age. Gothmog wasn't a large scary creature with a big sword. He was functionally a military genius who happened to be an orc. And he wasn't alone in demonstrating that kind of capability. Shagrat commanded the Tower of Cirith Ungol and managed the capture and processing of Frodo, a high-value prisoner carrying the most dangerous object in Middle-earth. That's an administrative and security role requiring judgment, planning, and independent authority that no common orc or even standard Uruk could have been trusted to handle without someone breathing down their neck. Shagrat operated with genuine autonomy, making real-time decisions about prisoner management in one of Sauron's most strategically sensitive locations. But here's the kicker. And it's the detail that reveals how fragile all of this really was. The Dark Lords concentrated enormous military capability into these individual chieftains, and that concentration created a catastrophic single point of failure. Bolg's death at the Battle of Five Armies didn't just remove one orc from the field, it precipitated rapid demoralization and combat breakdown across the entire orc army he commanded. Gothmog's fall during the Pelennor Fields triggered the same cascading collapse. One death, tens of thousands of orcs thrown into chaos. The loss of a single chieftain could unravel an entire military campaign in minutes. That's the terrifying paradox of orc chieftains. They were the rarest and most valuable military asset the Dark Lords possessed, individuals whose personal capabilities could swing the outcome of battles involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But they were also irreplaceable. You can breed another 10,000 Uruk-hai. You can churn out Morannon orcs by the legion. You cannot manufacture a Gothmog. You cannot mass-produce strategic genius. You just have to wait and hope that the endless brutality of orc society eventually produces another one. In a world full of orc swarms, it was never the 10,000 that made the difference. It was always the one. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.